Okay, welcome everyone. We're just going to give everybody a little bit of time to join. All right, we keep seeing that attendees number going up. Looks like people are joining. We're just going to give everybody a minute or so to be able to making sure they connect and everybody's making it on time. Before we kick off our DE&I, diversity and inclusion, what is it and how can Hogan help your organization? We've got an exciting, 40-ish, 45 minutes planned for you in terms of presentation and a very active Q&A afterwards. Really look forward to everybody participating in some of the online polls that we're offering as well. We promise you just a fantastic session. Again, just giving another minute for everybody to be able to join, and we'll go ahead and kick off the ever so exciting session that we've got here for you. Again, I'm just gonna check in on the numbers. It looks like it's slowed down a bit and everybody is on. And it is 2 minutes past the hour, so everybody should be on time and ready to go. Hey everybody, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate you taking out the time to be able to join us for diversity inclusion, and we'll have our presentations by our friends over at Hogan. I'm your host, Jag Nidra. I'm the Director of Sales here at DTech Humans. Any questions, any concerns, feel free to be able to reach out to me. My contact information will be on the last slide. I want to just take a second to be able to introduce, our presenters for the day. Chase, wave hello. Chase Winterberg holds a law degree from the University of Tulsa and is currently working on his dissertation to achieve his PhD in IO psychology. He's currently a research consultant at Hogan's talent analytics team. In his role, he manages research products while working with cross-functional project teams to consult clients on pre-validated solutions, validated customized solutions through job analysis, validity generalization, competency modeling, and criteria on kind of related validation. So, big mouthful in terms of what Chase does, but absolutely some of the brightest minds to be able to present this. And then my daily contact at Hogan, she seems to put up with me for a few years now. Karen is a senior consultant with Hogan. She oversees assessment usage in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Australia, and then obviously Canada. She's providing kind of our commercial and technical support to our distributors like us, and working with international consulting partners to deliver science-based solutions for complex problems in the talent management industry. Without further ado, over to you, Karen.
Yes, thank you, Jag. Well, welcome everyone. We are so excited to be here today. We have a couple of topics that we're going to cover, so I just want to orient you to what our agenda looks like. First, I want to cover the diversity and inclusion landscape, because this isn't just a topic in psychology and in hiring. It's really a topic that is being covered in general world events, so it's really a global issue. Next, I'm going to have Chase talk a little bit about the definitions of diversity and inclusion. And then I'm going to talk about the benefits of diversity and why companies are taking notice. Then I'm going to address what companies are currently doing to address diversity and inclusion issues. Chase is going to walk us through some research on personality assessment and diversity and inclusion. And then finally, I'll provide a wrap up and summarize before we move on to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. So again, the first thing I want to do is just set the stage by discussing some of the current topics that we see being discussed in the realm of diversity and inclusion and addressing their importance. So I'm going to start by bringing attention to some recent public events that have placed an even brighter spotlight on diversity and inclusion. The timing of this webinar is really it is very, very timely, so 1 year ago this week, the US was really rocked by the video showing George Floyd's death. And the effects of his death were not just limited to the US. There were protests all over the world after that video was released. The other cool thing about this event is that we saw a somewhat different response compared to prior responses to similar events. So organizational leaders were a lot more vocal than we've seen in the past about their support. Many CEOs issued statements pledging support to address race issues in their organizations and communities. And 1 year later, we have seen some actions from notable companies. So for example, the Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's food brands have recently been updated or logos have been removed to reduce the racial bias in those brands. Companies like PepsiCo, Adidas, and Google have set targets to increase minority representation in their leadership teams and in their supplier chain. And other companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon have stopped supporting police efforts to use racially biased facial recognition software. But diversity efforts don't just include race. LGBTQ workers have often been included under the diversity and inclusion umbrella, but recent legislative changes are now mandating organizations pay more attention to this group in their diversity and inclusion initiatives. In June 2020, the US joined 20 other countries who protect against workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. In a historic decision, the US Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act protects gay, lesbian, and transgender employees from discrimination based on sex. And the ruling was a 6-3 decision. This highlights the importance of organizations taking more time to consider the needs of LGBTQ workers as they work to promote an inclusive environment. And if you're interested in hearing more about this topic, our very own Chase Winterberg recently did a podcast on Hogan's podcast, The Science of Personality. So you can go check that out if you want to learn a little bit more about that ruling. So the previous slides highlight different events that have triggered many conversations around diversity and inclusion and brought those to the forefront. And there were even more that I could have included across other groups, such as female representation and neurodiverse populations. However, before we move forward, I'm going to let Chase take a minute to define and describe diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, and sorry, just before Chase, just before you take off, I apologize for jumping in. If anybody has any questions, any comments, please use the Q&A function, and we'll address them as they come. Sorry.
Thank you, no problem. I want to spend some time thinking about how we conceptualize diversity and inclusion, because the way that you or your organization defines these ideas is going to shape how you approach it in the workplace. So I like to think about diversity as just kind of the variations in the different kinds of people in a certain working group. And this not only includes demographic characteristics, race, religion, gender, sex, things like that. It also includes, personality, skills, abilities, other things that each individual uniquely brings to the workplace. And then inclusion is a necessary partner to diversity, as Karen will explain later in the presentations. Inclusion concerns basically two components, and it's based on a fundamental need to feel like you belong in the group and feel like your uniqueness is valued by the group. And this relates to the theory that our personality assessments are based on, which is socioanalytic theory. And this basically distinguishes different techniques in work groups. So people will either try to get ahead in the work group, get promoted, get recognized, or they'll try to get along. And they're not mutually exclusive, and personality basically explains the ways that people try to get ahead and get along. So there is already, we see pretty clear overlap with personality and inclusion. And then a common thing we see with organizations is they focus on what the law says about diversity and how to comply with diversity requirements in the workplace. but this tends to translate into kind of a check the box mentality or a compliance focus. Basically, they are just focusing on the bare minimum, and as long as they meet that, then no more effort is expended. That is not what we would recommend. As you can see, this is the legal approach from the US. I'm not trained to interpret Canadian law, but I did take a look at it, and I do see quite a bit of parallels from what I can tell with Title VII in the US, which makes it illegal to discriminate in the workplace. So this approach is based on protected classes, which is defined in terms of demographics. And as I explained, diversity involves much more than that. So it's important to look beyond that. With that said, it is important to consider the law because you want to make sure you're in compliance, but that's not enough. And then I also saw a parallel in Canadian law with the 4/5 rule in the US. So basically 4/5 or 80% is okay. So what that means is they are allowing for a little less inequality, which makes sense. You're going to have differences in different situations, but it's recommended to strive for equal opportunity for all. I'm not sure how this would operate in Canada, but there is a defense in the US, even if there is adverse impact, if a tool is related to job performance, that kind of wipes away the problem with diversity in most situations. So this has led organizations to prioritize prediction of job performance. However, there are ways to optimize the balance between getting more diversity and getting better performance. And there is no mention of inclusion or no consideration of inclusion beyond, harassment and bad conduct in the workplace. So as long as you're not, illegally harassing or treating people poorly, then inclusion is ignored. But as Karen will explain, inclusion is really essential to extracting the benefits of a diverse workplace. And with that, I'll pass it to Karen so she can talk about why diversity is important.
Yeah, thanks, Chase. So the next thing that in this next section here, what I want to do is present a few statistics that look at the reality of diversity and inclusion efforts and touch on legal repercussions for organizations who aren't focusing on diversity and inclusion. We're going to talk a little bit about the business case, so the ROI of diversity and inclusion, as well as the case for what's right, why companies have a moral obligation to focus on diversity and inclusion efforts. So the reality is that diversity is really important to the workforce. Glassdoor did a study showing that 67% of job seekers consider workplace diversity an important factor when they're looking for a new job. And as companies push for improving the candidate experience, they should be aware of this and consider how they can best demonstrate their policies. And as you might expect, a diverse workforce is more important to minority groups. So companies who want to attract the minority workers by promoting their diverse workforce will be able to bring in more applicants for the group that they are targeting. In addition, 50% of current employees want their workplace to do more to increase diversity. However, one study by the Harvard Business Review found that 78% of employees work at organizations that lack diversity in their leadership positions. And this isn't surprising, given that in 2018, 5% of the Fortune 500 companies were led by women. And that same year, 5% of Fortune 500 companies were also led by men named James. This is in comparison to only 5 African Americans leading a Fortune 500 company. And it's not just a US problem. A recent study in the UK found that 5% of their top 350 CEOs were women. And in April, there were more men named Peter than there were women in chief executive ranks. So let's talk a little bit about the legislation around discrimination and how that can affect organizations. So the map that you see here on this screen shows countries that have legislation that prohibits discrimination based on race and ethnicity. The red color highlights countries that have no laws targeting this type of discrimination, and the darkest green highlights companies that have specific laws in place. The orange and the lighter green highlight countries where there is some prohibition, but it's fairly broad in terms of how it's defined. Over 100 countries protect from discrimination in hiring based on both gender and race and ethnicity. And an additional 28 countries extend protection on the basis of gender or race and ethnicity, but not combined with both. And this is important because there's a significant cost to businesses when they break these discrimination laws. In the US, organizations spend an estimated $64 billion annually because of workplace discrimination. And it's not just the legal cost that's included in this number, it also includes the cost of losing and replacing more than 2 million American workers who leave their job each year due to unfairness and discrimination. Further highlighting the business case, we do see that diversity and inclusion can provide monetary benefits to organizations. So in a 2018 study by the Harvard Business Review, they found that companies with higher diversity had 19% higher innovation revenue. And when you combine diversity and an engaged workforce, organizations that are high in both outperform other companies by as much as 58%, according to a study by Gallup. We've seen the benefits of having female leadership during the pandemic and the responses for countries that were led by female leaders versus male leaders. And that also translates to business outcomes. Organizations that have women represented at the highest levels provide a 34% greater return to their shareholders. And although women only represent a small percentage of leadership in Fortune companies, those companies that they lead account for a greater share of the overall revenue. But there's also a moral reason for addressing issues surrounding diversity and inclusion. We need to focus on the systems and processes that have contributed to unfair treatment of marginalized groups. This plays out in the additional work or effort that's needed to be put forth by minority individuals to achieve the same outcomes of a majority group. So although we're seeing more women and minorities being included in the addition, there is additional work that has to be done, which can feel unfair to those groups. So for example, one study found that male job applicants are perceived to have higher levels of leadership potential, are rated as a better employment prospect than a female applicant who has a proven leadership track record. So a male that has potential to be a good leader is ranked higher or seen as a better employee than a female leader who has already had a proven track record and demonstrated that she can do the job. A study in the political realm found that female candidates have to have higher levels of qualifications to overcome negative feminine stereotypes that characterize women as ill-qualified for leadership positions. So now that we have a case for building and promoting a diverse and inclusive organization, let's turn to what organizations are doing in this space. So the first thing that I want to do is get an idea of what your companies are doing around diversity and inclusion via the poll that's on your screen here. This is anonymous, so we're not going to be calling anyone out, but I just want to get an idea of, do your companies, are they emphasizing diversity and inclusion? Are they communicating about it? Is it linked to performance goals? And do you feel like your company spends sufficient time and money on diversity and inclusion efforts?
So we'll give everybody another 15-ish seconds to be able to reply to this.
Yeah.
Karen, the session's going really well. I've got so many questions for you for the question and answer period. Participants, please keep them coming, and it'll lead to a great session afterwards. All right, that looks like enough time to be able to answer this.
All right, Zach, you want to share the results here? Yeah, so that's great. So 40%, do emphasize diversity and inclusion in the business strategy. It looks like there's a lot of communication happening about diversity and inclusion, but there's not a lot of linking of diversity and inclusion goals to performance. And a lot of you feel like your company could spend more time and money on diversity and inclusion efforts, or there's not a lot of significant initiatives at this moment. So yeah, thank you for doing that. And I think so kind of remember this here. So I'm going to show some numbers from a benchmarking study in Canada later on, so that we can compare those numbers. So the meme on the screen here is meant to make light of the reality that many minorities face. Something to think about here is that the risk of, there's a high risk of companies rejecting the minority employees that they've worked so hard to hire. Truly increasing diversity might need to lead to more of a cultural change and emphasis on the importance of inclusion. A survey from organizations found that the top 3 diversity and inclusion initiatives for companies were recruiting and retaining diverse talent, focusing on diversity and inclusion training, learning and development initiatives, and fostering a diverse and inclusive workplace culture. But there tends to be an over-focus on diversity and not on inclusion. So we've seen a lot of commitments to increase diversity, whether that be increasing the number of women and people of color in leadership or targeting unrepresented minorities in their recruitment efforts. However, we're not seeing as many efforts around the inclusion piece of this. We are seeing more organizations speak out against the injustices that they're seeing. We're seeing a lot more chief diversity and inclusion officers being appointed, more than most of them have been appointed within really the last 5 years. And there's really been an increase in the diversity training. So McKinsey reported that about $8 billion per year is spent on diversity trainings just in the US. So one thing that I wanted to do was kind of get an idea of what are Canadian companies really doing here. So the data that you see here on your screen is from a benchmarking study that was conducted by the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. So you can see here, and I think this is pretty comparable to the results we saw for the poll here. So about 73% of senior leaders felt that their companies emphasize diversity and inclusion in business strategies, and 68% felt that their companies were communicating about diversity and inclusion to their employees. However, how much of this is actually is just talk and not actually action? So what we see here is that the senior leaders also felt like people were not, very few of them were actually looking at goals and tracking goals around diversity and inclusion. And only 32% believed that the company was spending enough time and money on diversity and inclusion efforts. So although it seems like companies are emphasizing diversity and inclusion, it might not always be followed up with a lot of action. So what should organizations be doing? So I've got a couple of things here that I just kind of 3 things that I advice pieces that I want to provide here. So the first one is, companies should be identifying areas of possible bias. So, we recommend taking a deep look across all aspects of the organization and talent management. And this can be a really uncomfortable activity. So, take it slow, but keep pushing even when it might be painful, some of the things that are being uncovered. Then as you identify these areas, it's important to identify what metrics you should use to evaluate progress or effectiveness. Maybe it's an actual representation number, maybe it's engagement scores, or maybe it's turnover data for minority employees. And then the last piece here is making sure that this isn't a one-stop solution. It's an ongoing effort to target discrimination in the organization. And assessments in general, but personality assessments and Hogan can help with this in a couple of different ways. So for the first one here, Hogan and personality assessment in general can help in the recruitment and the development processes, really throughout the talent management lifecycle by providing assessments that are free of bias to use during recruitment and development. Assessments, and Hogan specifically, is proud to emphasize the data aspect of our business and provide an objective measurement of these processes. And then finally, we can provide ongoing development to continue building strategic self-awareness. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chase to highlight some of the research that we have done with personality assessment and diversity and inclusion initiatives.
Thanks, Karen. First, I want to give a background of the core assessments that we use. You'll see these in the research I'm about to discuss. And while we use our assessments because that's what we have available, but most of these results should generalize to other scientifically validated workplace personality assessments. So we have the Hogan Personality Inventory, or the HPI, which gets at your everyday strengths. The MVPI, or the Motives, Values, Preferences Inventory, that's the mouthful, sorry. It gets at what you want in your job. And the HDS, or Hogan Development Survey, tells you what about your characteristics might derail your performance in times of stress or low self-monitoring. So an easy way to think about this is the MVPI is the inside. It tells you what you want out of your job or what types of job you might like. The HPI tells you how you might get there, and the HDS tells you what might get in your way. So I want to cover two main points here. So I want to talk about how just using Hogan and scientifically validated personality assessments in general for selection can promote fairness and diversity in the applicant pool. And then I will explain some research that points to specific scales or characteristics to look at if you wanted to target people that would behave inclusively in the workplace, such as leaders. So first, how using personality assessments in general can help maintain the diversity of the applicant pool. So as I mentioned before, it is important to not only care about the prediction of job performance, but to balance this with maintaining diversity and inclusion. But to that point, just want to point out that there is abundance of evidence out there that personality assessments can predict beneficial outcomes in the workplace, such as job fit, which can also lead to better performance, people staying in the organization longer, and less stress, and just enjoying the job much better. And so you see here we've compared this is a lot of graphs to throw at you, sorry about that, but the main takeaway here is you see that the multiple lines on each graph are basically overlapping into one line. And this would suggest that across these categories, we are not seeing meaningful differences on the various assessments that we have to look at. And while the bottom row, the US race, is based on US-based racial categories, this basically gets at the idea that irrelevant factors are not distinguishing people's scores on these personality assessments.
Yeah, so just to orient you to this slide a little bit, we've got, differences in sex or gender here across the top, age across that middle row, and then the race at the bottom, and then each of the columns. So the first column is that bright side assessment, and then the next column is the dark side assessment, and then finally the values assessment there. So really the point we want to make here is that there's really no meaningful subgroup differences for personality, which is how we can provide a unbiased measurement in the hiring process.
Exactly. Thank you. And a common question we get is, okay, so if you're selecting on personality and you're talking about diversity in terms of things beyond demographics, aren't you going to just create personality clones in the workplace? And if you approach it correctly, the answer is no. So this graph is an example from my research team at Hogan Assessment. So we tend to select on interpersonal sensitivity and prudence, which kind of translates into the 5-factor model: agreeableness or conscientiousness, if you're familiar with that. Basically, how friendly you are and how hardworking and detail-oriented you are. And so you see there's less variation there. Most people in our team score high on both of these scales because that's what we're looking for in selection. But by allowing the other characteristics or scales to vary, we still get a good mix of individuals in our team. And so, you know, nobody shows up with just one characteristic, one personality trait. They have multiple personality traits that interact with each other and combine. So as long as you are having alignment on the things that matter, that are going to allow people to function properly in their role, and you allow the other things to vary, you still get a good mix of personality, characteristics, and skills. Now I want to talk about how you can specifically target people who will behave inclusively in the workplace. So we conducted a meta-analysis of our criterion-related validation studies, where individuals had taken our assessments and then they had received supervisory ratings on competencies that align with inclusion. So as I mentioned before, inclusion kind of has two components. It's about making people feel like they are uniquely valued. And so we are calling this dimension leveraging diversity. And as you can see from some of these sample items, it has kind of two further components that you could break it down into, basically around discouraging discrimination and treating people fairly is one category. And then the other is, you know, valuing other, you know, diverse perspectives. So these are some of the items that were included in the supervisory ratings for this, you know, valuing uniqueness component of inclusion that we used in the research. Then the other component, as I mentioned before, was about, you know, making people feel like they belong in the work group. And so as you can see here with the sample items, this also has kind of two different categories. So first, you know, just being considerate and sensitive of others, treating people nicely. And then the second category is basically about empathy and being able to think about things from others' perspectives. And so we aggregated all of our criterion-related validation studies that correlated our skills with these competencies. And on average, these are the trends that we saw here. So the takeaway from this is if you are selecting individuals who are high on adjustment or calm, you know, emotionally stable, people that are perceptive, you know, warm, friendly, nice to be around, they care about others' feelings, and then individuals who are conscientious and self-disciplined, they're going to be more likely to behave inclusively in the workplace. And then from the DART personality scales, or the derailers, as you would expect, we see negative correlations here. So this would suggest that higher scores or higher behaviors in line with these tendencies would translate into less inclusive behavior in the workplace. And so what we see here is excitable, skeptical, bold, and mischievous. And this translates into people that are volatile, so others' intentions, they think everybody's kind of out to get them, or they can be kind of over arrogant, excessively confident, or, you know, kind of they tend to kind of break the rules. And so individuals that are going to have some of these characteristics are going to be more likely to not behave inclusively in the workplace. And then we looked at what people value in their workplace and how this might relate to behaving inclusively in the workplace. And we see kind of a difference here. So recognition and power are kind of getting at people that care about their status. You know, they want to stand out, they want to get promoted, they want to be in charge, they want to get recognized. And we're seeing kind of a negative correlation here, which suggests that individuals that prioritize these things are going to be less likely to behave inclusively. And this kind of relates back to the distinction between getting ahead and getting along that I talked about before. You know, this goes back to people's need. There's kind of, they need to have these needs met, both of them, and kind of balance them. They want to feel like they stand out, they're unique, they bring something to the table, but they also need to feel like they belong. But if you're like looking at, you know, how behaviors are being received, you know, if you're prioritizing how you get ahead over getting along with others, then they're probably going to feel less inclusive or less included. And so to further support this, we see a positive correlation with altruism, which would be more in line with that getting along dimension. And this basically describes individuals who care about helping others or society. So in summary, we would recommend looking at characteristics like these to, you know, in hiring, to identify individuals who are going to be more likely to behave inclusively once they get in the organization. And if you have individuals that are struggling in these areas, then you could focus on developing these in a more development context. And then, you know, it's the importance of leadership is that, you know, resources are usually limited in hiring and development interventions, and so sometimes you can only focus on a certain class of individuals. And when you're in a bind like that, it's I would recommend prioritizing leaders, because they have more of an influence on the rest of the organization. You know, they have decision-making authority. They are in charge of people, so there's a sort of a trickle-down effect. You know, how they act is going to affect their subordinates, and so if you focus on leaders when you're in a bind, you're going to have much more bang for your buck that way. And then I'll pass it over to Karen to talk about some final thoughts.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of information that we've presented here today. So I just want to kind of summarize it and provide some final wrap up here. So after we've gone through all this, you know, this all probably seems like a piece of cake, right? Of course, I'm just kidding. You know, we would, you know, really be remiss if we made it seem like diversity and inclusion was a simple fix, because it's really a complex topic, and Hogan and assessment in general is really just part of a larger solution and effort on the part of the organization. We also recognize that it can be difficult to implement diversity and inclusion programs, and they might not always lead to positive outcomes. So some efforts such as, you know, diversity training programs and maybe, you know, emphasizing, you know, women need to sort of, you know, lean in and push themselves forward and promote themselves in the organizations might actually backfire in some situations. So for example, women who negotiate for raises may do themselves more harm than good. And there are all kinds of really well-meaning people in corporate America that are, you know, that have really tried and spent a lot of money trying to retain and advance women and minorities, and it doesn't always work. Some research suggests that organizational diversity alone, such as policies, trainings, and awards, can cause some companies to feel like they have to have an illusion that fair decision-making procedures have been implemented. So it might be that, you know, some organizations might, have, again, sort of that check the box attitude. We did the thing, we implemented the policies, and so they might not always, believe or react or may react negatively to claims of discrimination because they kind of just assume that all of those issues have been addressed. And we haven't even touched on the complexity of thinking about diversity in more of a global context. Diversity and inclusion is not just a US issue. The national culture can really impact how diversity and inclusion programs will take. So if there's a mismatch between national and organizational culture, it can actually exacerbate negative consequences. And equity is one of the newest additions to this group as well. So DE&I is actually becoming more at the forefront. So equity is really the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that prevent the full participation of some groups. So, we're seeing more things being added to this group here and further, making this a complex topic. We're also seeing a more recent push to add things like justice to this group of topics as well. And we have there is an article here to go along with this. When we send out this presentation, I will include some of these citations in it as well, so that you'll be able to access some of the additional information that we talked about. So just to summarize, Hogan doesn't have all the answers to your diversity and inclusion problems, but we have always been, and we still are committed to helping increase diversity in organizations. Again, just to summarize the key points that were made here today, using the assessments and selection can help increase diversity because personality doesn't discriminate. You can also use personality assessment to help support leaders, identify and support leaders who will foster an environment that the organization wants to build. And finally, you can also help use personality assessment to provide feedback to help build strategic self-awareness of individuals' own personalities, but at a leadership level, also the personalities of others on their team and organization. So by understanding how others might be different in terms of personality, might also help lead them to be more inclusive and recognize the value and the strengths of others in other minority and underrepresented groups. So with that, I think we will go ahead and open it up to all of your questions.
And there's quite a few here to keep us busy and fantastic questions. Thank you, everybody. And again, if you have more, please send them through. Karen, one of the questions that we received was, are there any assessments in the Hogan suite to measure bias specifically?
Yeah, so I would say that, really to some extent, all of them measure how you might be biased towards one thing or another. So not bias in terms of, are you racially biased against someone, but in terms of, we tend to kind of focus in on what we value or what's important to us. So for example, with the example that Chase shared around the data science team, you can see that being interpersonally sensitive and being able to work with others and having a strong orientation towards details is really important for that group as a whole. And they may not always understand if others, just need to get the presentation out or have that sense of urgency and don't want to check it for every single, missing period or, making sure it's absolutely grammatically correct. And so you can have this bias towards needing to always have that detail orientation and always needing to put out something perfect. So you're kind of biased in that direction. And it's especially, I think, useful for the MDPI as well. So what are those things that you're focused on? Are you focused on helping people? You might not always understand if other people have more of a hand up rather than a hand out mentality. So, by building that strategic self-awareness, I think you can become aware of where you might have some specific biases yourself.
Great, thank you. What was the sample size used in the promoting fairness slide?
I am actually not sure. I can send out the link to link you to that study specifically. Yeah.
Great. Can you talk a little bit more about the scope and scale of the HDS meta-analysis? Again, it's another question about how big was the group and for what period of time, and then how was it tested and validated?
So I can send more information on the various sample sizes. I don't have that right in front of me, but in terms of the scope, so our sample was basically the entire workforce, all across the globe. Every criterion related validation study that we had that had data on our assessments and these competencies. So this included leaders, people from all different industries, individual contributors, people from all different countries. And so with that, we're pretty confident that it would, generalize pretty well to other situations. And so
Yeah.
in terms of how these were all validated, so these were professional, conducted criterion related validation studies. So when clients hire us to come build a custom hiring solution or custom profile, we go in and do like a local validation study where we collect their performance data, and we will collect data on their specific the competencies that they say are important through a job analysis. And so in the cases where these inclusive competencies were important, that's when we pulled those through.
Yeah, so, just to kind of, I guess further elaborate on that a little bit, Hogan conducts criterion studies where we collect supervisor ratings of these competencies, and we also collect personality information on employees. So when we're validating these competencies, we're looking at the relationship between someone's scores on the personality assessments and how their supervisor has rated them on their propensity to demonstrate the behaviors associated with those competencies.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. There was here's an interesting question. What do you think, what do you do about people who do not answer the inventory honestly? That is, that they try to project, a different DE&I kind of personality and not necessarily being honest.
Yeah, so, I think one of the nice things about personality assessment is there's really no right or wrong answers. And so, and for the most part, people are not really aware of maybe what people are looking for specifically. So, they're not always aware of what they're taking it for, and they don't always know what's actually predictive. So for example, you wouldn't, if you were someone just taking it, applying for a job, you wouldn't necessarily know what the characteristics are that the organization is looking for. And so it would be difficult for you to, kind of try to get a profile that fits that. We've actually conducted studies where we've had people take the assessments in a selection context, and then we have asked them to create them, retake it, but create a specific profile, and they've been unable to do that.
Super interesting. Karen, I've got a question that's going to be directed towards you. What does DE&I look like in different cultures?
Yeah, so that's a really, really great question. I think that it's definitely, of course, we take a really, really US centric approach to it here. But, again, I think you have to, keep in mind what the national culture is, what the values are with the different organizations. And of course, there is going to be different minority groups in different regions. So, the race and ethnicity breakdown is going to look different in different countries. So, I think that, you still are going to want similar personality characteristics in terms of someone who's going to be open to others and, someone who's going to foster inclusive behaviors. But I think how you're actually defining and measuring the diversity and the inclusion in the organization is going to depend on the country and the region that you're working in.
Yeah, no, totally fair. Chase, I've got one that I think is going to be right up your alley. What is your view on combining data points and assessments? And is it using one assessment to make decisions kind of counter to best practices?
Yeah, so I am in favor of combining different data points. I like all the data I can get. I'm that's what I do in my spare time is play with data. But no, from a practical perspective, you want to maximize the behavioral domain that you're trying to explain in your hiring practices. So the more data points you combine, the better able you are to do that. Now, the data points that you combine, you want to consider each one in terms of how it's impacting diversity, how it's impacting performance. So you want to carefully select each data point. So as long as they're carefully selected data points, it's usually best practice to combine them. You don't want to combine multiple data points that are explaining the same thing also, because that's kind of redundant. It's going to waste your resources. So you want things that are explaining different pieces of the behavioral domain that you care about. And so, for example, that's why we have kind of the HPI, which is, how you behave on a day-to-day basis. We have the HDS, that's getting at how you act under times of stress, and the MVPI, and that's like what you want out of your job or your work environment. And so these are talking about different pieces, albeit related, of the behavioral domain in the workplace. So combining these, and we have seen this empirically, maximizes, the benefits that you want to see.
I appreciate that. So, just to kind of follow up from that, how do you link the Hogan scales to the different competencies that were shared?
So we looked at the meta-analytic correlations between our scales and the competencies that we kind of aligned to the inclusion definition. So as I was talking about the definition of inclusion at the beginning of the presentation, we pulled this from the empirical literature around inclusion. There's kind of those two components, and we found, luckily, in our data set, our archival data set, that we had two competencies that mapped perfectly onto those dimensions. And so we have meta-analyses that connect our scales to our specific competencies that we use for synthetic validation studies when we do validity generalization for clients. And so we pulled that evidence to look at what scales were predicting these specific competencies.
All right, Chase, I'm going to give you a little bit of a rest, and I'll throw one at Karen now. Can assessments help get more diverse candidates into a position to be interviewed by employers?
Yeah, I think the slide that we showed showing that there's no subgroup differences, it's a really, assessment is one way that you can really narrow in on the actual strengths and weaknesses of a candidate. Hogan has some offerings in terms of the platforms that you can use where you can even hide, names and things like that, so that you're not even looking at anything other than the qualifications of that person based on their personality scores. And so I think that it's one way to be able to sort of take that bias out of the hands of the decision makers by focusing them in on the characteristics that are going to make someone successful, and so then they're not also trying to they're not also looking at the race, the gender, the ethnicity of the individual that they're looking at.
All right, next question. How does Hogan ensure that their data sets are diverse? Trace, that sounds more of a question for you.
Right, so we have all sorts of different normative data sets. We do have a global one. We have different ones for different regions and stuff like that. And the way we do this is we make sure that the sample is representative of what it should look like in those different regions. So we make sure no one is overrepresented and no one is underrepresented. And so we design our kind of selection of what goes into these data sets that way, and we make sure that everybody is being represented in our data sets that we use for things like that.
Great. So we've got a lot of Hogan certified people on this call right now. And one of the questions that have come up is, how do you coach someone who scores low on a scale linked to DE&I?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we presented sort of a wide range of scales here today. I think that the important thing to keep in mind is, again, no one scale operates ever by itself. So, I think it's important to kind of look across the range of scales and see, it's a development opportunity. It's an opportunity to look at it and say, okay, maybe you score a little lower in this area, but here's some other strengths that you have. Maybe you score, sort of like we talked about the MVPI, maybe you score really high on recognition and on power, but you also score really high on altruism. How can we, capture the altruistic need that you have, value that you have, and think about it in a way that helps you get the power and the recognition needs met. Maybe it's, you are bringing in more people who are diverse and they can help continue to educate you and coach. And as a result, that makes your team do better overall. And so I think, again, kind of thinking about all of them. And again, it's, no one's going to have an exactly perfect profile. And so it's really all about that strategic awareness and figuring out what's relevant for you to focus on.
So I've got about 3 other questions. I know we're just coming up with kind of 3 minutes left in our hour. However, we do have the ability to go over a little bit if people would like to kind of stay on and listen to the answers to these 3 questions. This one, again, Karen, sounds like it's for you. Is there a difference between organizations who have chief diversity officers and simply being demographically diverse?
Yeah, so, I do think that there is something to be said for companies who have taken the step to appoint a chief diversity officer rather than just focusing on becoming a more demographically diverse company. One of the things that you kind of find out once you get out of grad school and you go into an organization is that nothing gets done unless someone's sort of the champion for it and someone is the one being the driving force behind it. And so I think having somebody who is in the C-suite, who can stand, who that is their job, that is their focus, it probably means that those organizations are going to be more successful in their efforts to have a diverse group, as opposed to companies for whom it's, no one's really leading the charge in that organization.
Yeah, thank you. Chase, I think I've got a tough one here for you, or at least an interesting one. What would you say about organizations that are just checking the box, we are diverse, or doing diversity hires?
I would recommend kind of revisiting how you're conceptualizing diversity. That to me would suggest you're kind of just focusing on making sure that you're covered, that you're complying with the requirements. And basically what that translates to me is you're doing the bare minimum. So yeah, you do need to be complying with all of the requirements, but you need to look beyond that. There's always room for improvement. Don't ever give up on trying to maximize diversity or inclusion. Just look beyond what is the bare minimum and try to, really focus on the benefits of your efforts, not just, oh, have you done enough?
That's great. It looks like it's our final question, unless somebody pops up another one. But Karen, I've got one here for you. How does diversity affect an organization who also wants employees to fit?
Yeah, so, I think that, fit is kind of a complicated topic. A lot of organizations sometimes use fit as a way to discriminate because they feel like the individuals they just didn't fit with our organization. So I think that, again, there aren't any subgroup differences that we're finding. So I think the important thing, again, is finding out what are those characteristics that are really important for success, and then focusing in on finding people who have those characteristics, and again, who fit what they need to have to be successful in that role, rather than maybe, and kind of, trying to bring in candidates who have that from a diverse range of backgrounds. So that's one way that you can get people who are diverse, but who are also fitting within what that organization needs them to do.
Great. That's all the questions for today. Karen, thank you very much for coming on and and presenting the way you did. Chase, the amount of information and playing with data you've done has obviously brought some really strong insights, and we do really appreciate it. My contact information is on the screen if we need to go ahead and further conversations. However, I will be reaching out to everyone with the slide deck and where some of the information came from to be able to kind of go into this deeper. Thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate it. And I look forward to connecting with everybody that was on this call. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.